My name is Duncan Morley, and this happened to me on November 12, 1994. I was a truck driver, making runs across the Midwest, hauling everything from fresh produce to construction materials. This story starts on a route I'd taken dozens of times, but that night, everything went sideways. I was on I-70, driving through Kansas. It was late, probably around 11 p.m. The radio played some classic rock, the kind of tunes that keep you awake when the road seems endless. I just picked up a load of steel beams from Topeka, heading towards Denver. The skies were clear, the kind of starry night that makes you feel small and alone on the open road. I remember stopping at a rest area near Junction City. I needed a break, a cup of coffee, and maybe a quick nap before pushing on. The place was deserted except for one old pickup truck. I didn't think much of it. Truckers and travelers come and go all night. I got my coffee from a vending machine that probably hadn't been cleaned in years and sat at a picnic table, letting the cool night air wake me up a bit. After about 20 minutes, I headed back to my rig. I was climbing up into the cab when I saw him. A man, probably in his late 30s, standing by the edge of the lot. He was tall, with a rugged look, the kind of guy who could be a ranch hand or maybe an off-duty trucker. He had on a flannel shirt and jeans, nothing unusual, but there was something off about the way he just stood there, staring. "Need a lift?" I called out, thinking maybe he was stranded. "No thanks," he replied, his voice flat. "Just enjoying the night." I nodded, climbed into my truck, and pulled out of the lot. As I merged back onto the highway, I saw him in the rearview mirror, still standing there, watching. I shrugged it off and focused on the road ahead. About an hour later, fatigue hit me harder than expected. I decided to pull over at another rest stop, this one even smaller and more isolated. I parked my truck and climbed into the sleeper cab to catch a few hours of sleep. The hum of the engine was my lullaby. I must have dozed off pretty quickly because the next thing I remember was waking up to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, just a subtle scratching sound. I sat up, listening. The noise was coming from the back of the trailer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, my breath visible in the cold night air. The rest stop was eerily quiet. I walked around to the back of the trailer, shining my light. At first I saw nothing unusual, just my truck and the empty parking lot. Then I noticed the lock on the trailer door was broken. My heart started pounding. I opened the door slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Inside, among the steel beams, was a man. It was the same guy from the previous rest stop. He was sitting on one of the beams, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "What the hell are you doing in my truck?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the trailer. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and started walking towards me. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. He moved with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I felt the urge to run, but my legs seemed glued to the spot. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I fell back, dropping the flashlight. We grappled in the dark, and I could feel his strength overpowering mine. I managed to get a hand free and punched him square in the jaw. He staggered back, giving me just enough time to scramble out of the trailer and slam the door shut. I ran to the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, my breath coming in ragged gasps. 911, what's your emergency? There's a guy in my trailer, I panted. He attacked me. I'm at the rest stop off I-70, near mile marker 331. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. I stayed in the cab, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. Minutes felt like hours. I expected the man to come barreling out of the trailer any second, but he didn't. The silence was unnerving. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. 2 officers approached, guns drawn. I unlocked the cab and stepped out, pointing to the trailer. "He's in there," I said, my voice shaking. The officers nodded and cautiously opened the trailer door. Their flashlights pierced the darkness inside. I held my breath, waiting for the struggle to ensue, but it didn't. Instead, the officers looked back at me, puzzled. "There's no one here," one of them said. "What? That's impossible," I shouted, running to the trailer. But it was empty, just steel beams and shadows. "He must have escaped," the other officer suggested, but there were no signs of forced entry or exit. They took my statement, and I described the man as best I could. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to stay alert. I thanked them, still shaken, and watched as they drove off into the night. I climbed back into my truck, every nerve on edge. Sleep was out of the question, so I decided to keep driving. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By morning, I was exhausted and decided to stop at a truck stop near the Colorado border. I parked among the other big rigs, the hustle and bustle of drivers giving me a sense of security. After grabbing a bite to eat, I called my buddy, Randy. He was also a trucker, someone who'd understand the weirdness of the previous night. "Hey Duncan," he answered, his voice cheery. "How's the road treating you?" "You wouldn't believe the night I had," I replied, recounting the events. "Damn, man," Randy said. "That's creepy. You should get a gun. Never know what kind of crazies are out there." "I know, but you know me. I've never been a gun guy. I might have to reconsider." We chatted for a bit longer before hanging up. I felt a bit better after talking to Randy, but the unease lingered. I decided to take a nap in the truck stop's parking lot, surrounded by the sounds of engines and chatter. I woke up in the late afternoon, feeling somewhat refreshed. I checked the trailer, finding everything as it should be. As I was about to climb back into the cab, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it and felt a chill run down my spine. "Next time you won't be so lucky." The note was handwritten, the letters jagged and uneven. My mind raced. How did he find me again? I looked around, but there was no sign of the man. I shoved the note in my pocket and started the truck, my heart pounding. I drove straight to Denver, stopping only when necessary. Each stop was filled with paranoia, my eyes scanning for any sign of the stranger. By the time I delivered the load and reached a motel for the night, I was a wreck. I locked the door, pushed a chair against it, and double-checked the windows. Only then did I let myself collapse on the bed. Sleep came fitfully, dreams filled with faceless men and endless highways. The next morning, I called the police and reported the note. They took it seriously, assigning a detective to the case. Detective Harris met me at a diner in Denver, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s. "We're looking into it," she said after taking my statement. "We've had a few reports of strange incidents along I-70, but nothing concrete. We'll keep you posted." "Thanks," I said, though her words did little to comfort me. For the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rest stop, every diner, every gas station, I was on high alert. But there were no more notes, no more sightings. Gradually, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though I was never quite the same. Months later, I heard from Detective Harris. They had found a man fitting the description in connection with another incident, but he'd vanished before they could apprehend him. The case went cold, and so did my trail of fear. I still drive those long hauls, but I'm more cautious now. I carry a knife, and I'm considering Randy's advice about getting a gun. That night changed me. It's a reminder that no matter how familiar the road, danger can be just around the corner. And every time I pass that rest stop near Junction City, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there watching. My name is Clyde Baxter, and this happened to me on November 12, 1996. I was a truck driver, hauling goods across the country, just trying to make a living. I'd been on the road for about 15 years by then, seen a lot of weird stuff, but nothing like what I'm about to tell you. I was driving through the back roads of southern Indiana, a route I wasn't too familiar with. The company had given me a last-minute job, delivering a load of lumber to a small town I'd never heard of. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and I was running low on gas and patience. The radio had lost signal miles back, and the only company I had was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt. I pulled into a small, rundown gas station that looked like it hadn't seen business in years. The sign was flickering, and the place had an eerie silence about it. But I was desperate. I parked the truck and walked over to the lone pump. An old man, probably in his 70s, came out from the station's office. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and he had a kind of vacant stare that made me uneasy. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep it short. "Fill her up, please." He nodded and started pumping gas. I glanced around, noticing how deserted the place was. There were no other cars, no houses in sight, just dense woods surrounding the station. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. While he was filling up, I decided to stretch my legs and walked around the back of the station. That's when I saw it. A rusty old truck, covered in dirt and grime, with its driver's door hanging open. Something about it seemed off. I stepped closer and saw dark stains on the seat and the steering wheel. Blood. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding. I thought about calling the cops, but my cell phone was dead, and the payphone by the office looked like it hadn't worked in years. I hurried back to my truck where the old man was finishing up. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. $20, he replied, still with that vacant stare. I handed him the money, jumped into my cab, and drove off as fast as I could without looking back. My mind was racing. What had I just seen? I needed to get out of there and report it to the authorities as soon as possible. About 10 miles down the road, I saw a woman standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. She looked terrified. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. She ran up to the truck, tears streaming down her face. "Please help me," she cried. "My boyfriend, he's hurt. We were attacked." I motioned for her to get in. She climbed into the passenger seat, trembling. Her clothes were torn, and she had bruises all over her arms. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Back there in the woods," she said, pointing behind us. "We were camping. Some guy came out of nowhere and attacked us. I managed to escape, but he's still back there." I nodded and turned the truck around, heading back towards the gas station. As we approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The old man was standing in the middle of the road holding a shotgun, the same vacant stare, but now with a sinister smile. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. The woman screamed, and I reached for the tire iron under my seat. The old man fired a shot, hitting the windshield but missing us. I threw the truck into reverse and floored it, backing away as fast as I could. "What do we do?" the woman sobbed. "We get to the nearest town and call the cops," I said, my hand shaking on the wheel. We drove for what felt like hours until we finally saw lights in the distance. It was a small diner, open 24 hours. I pulled in, and we rushed inside, shouting for help. The staff and customers looked at us like we were crazy, but they called the police. While we waited, the woman told me her name was Sarah. She and her boyfriend, Mike, had been on a road trip, camping in different spots along the way. They'd chosen a secluded area near the gas station for privacy, not knowing what was lurking nearby. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later. We told them everything, and they headed out to investigate. Sarah and I stayed at the diner, drinking coffee and trying to calm down. It was the longest night of my life. The next morning, the cops came back with grim news. They'd found Mike's body in the woods, not far from where Sarah had escaped. He'd been brutally beaten and left to die. They also found the old man's shack nearby, filled with disturbing evidence: bloody clothes, weapons, and even some human remains. The old man himself was nowhere to be found. The police launched a manhunt, but as far as I know, they never caught him. Sarah was devastated, but she thanked me for saving her life. I stayed with her until her family arrived, then I got back in my truck and drove away. the weight of the night's events heavy on my mind. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm driving alone on those dark, empty roads. It's a reminder that you never really know what's out there, lurking in the shadows. And every time I pass by a rundown gas station, I feel a shiver run down my spine, remembering the old man's vacant stare and sinister smile. Life went on, but I never quite felt the same. I kept driving, but I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. The company offered me a different route, which I gladly accepted. I never went back to that part of Indiana. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded a bit, but it never completely disappeared. I'd hear about similar stories on the news, people going missing, strange attacks, and it always brought me back to that gas station and the old man with the shotgun. I stayed in touch with Sarah for a while. She moved out of state and tried to start over, but the trauma of losing Mike and the terror of that night haunted her. We'd exchange letters every now and then, but eventually we lost touch. I retired from truck driving a few years ago, but I still have nightmares sometimes. In them, I'm back at that gas station. The old man is there, and I can't escape. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and it takes a while to calm down. I don't tell many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But it's a story that needs to be told, a warning to others to always be cautious, to trust your instincts, and to be aware of the dangers that can hide in plain sight. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes the most ordinary situations can turn into your worst nightmare. I learned that the hard way, and even though I've moved on, a part of me will always be that scared truck driver on a dark road in Indiana, trying to outrun a nightmare that felt all too real. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to stay alert, trust your gut, and never let your guard down. You never know who or what you might encounter on those lonely, forgotten roads. My name is Victor Langston, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I was a truck driver back then, running long hauls between Phoenix and Portland. I loved the solitude of the open road, the hum of the engine, and the feel of the asphalt under my wheels. But this particular trip is one I'll never forget. Not because of the journey, but because of what happened at the rest stop near Twin Falls, Idaho. I'd been on the road for about 12 hours, and my eyes felt like sandpaper. The coffee wasn't doing much anymore, so I decided to pull over for a quick nap. There's a rest area about 15 miles outside Twin Falls, not much more than a couple of vending machines and a restroom, but it's quiet and usually empty at night. Perfect for a few hours of shut-eye. I parked my rig and climbed into the sleeper cab. I didn't even bother to set an alarm. I figured my body would wake me when it had enough, as it always did. I drifted off almost immediately, the sounds of the highway fading into the background. I woke up to a strange sound. It was subtle at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent. It took a moment to realize it was someone trying the door handle on my cab. My first thought was that it was another driver needing help, but the insistence of the rattling set off alarm bells. No one in their right mind would try to open a stranger's truck in the middle of the night. I reached under my pillow for the baseball bat I always kept there. I didn't own a gun, never saw the need for one, but a solid piece of wood could do plenty of damage if necessary. I stayed still, listening. The rattling stopped and I heard footsteps moving away from the cab. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure heading toward the restroom. I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. I debated whether to confront the person or just drive off. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of the truck, bat in hand, and crept toward the restrooms. The night was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. I reached the building and pressed my back against the wall, straining to hear any sound from inside. A soft thud, like something heavy hitting the floor, reached my ears, then silence. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the bat, and stepped inside. The restroom was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent light casting unsettling shadows. There were 3 stalls, all closed. I bent down to look for feet under the doors, but saw nothing. I pushed open the first stall door. Empty. The second stall was the same. As I reached for the third door, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, bat raised, but there was no one there. Just the dimly lit room and the hum of the flickering light. I turned back to the third stall and pushed it open. It was empty too. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The long hours on the road can mess with your mind. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye in the mirror above the sinks. A dark shape, standing just outside the restroom door. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but the doorway was empty. I was starting to think I was losing it. I backed out of the restroom, my eyes darting around the empty parking lot. There was no sign of the person who had tried my door. I hurried back to my truck, jumped in and locked the doors. My pulse was racing, but I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe looking for a place to sleep or something to steal. Still, I didn't feel safe. I decided to drive to the next town, where I knew there'd be a truck stop with other drivers around. Safety in numbers and all that. I pulled out of the rest area, my eyes scanning the dark highway for any sign of movement. I was about 5 miles down the road when I saw headlights in my mirrors. A car was following me, its beams too bright in the dark. I sped up, but the car matched my speed. My palms were slick on the steering wheel. I didn't want to believe it, but it felt like the driver was after me. I decided to test it. I slowed down to let the car pass, but it stayed behind me. Then, I sped up again, and it did the same. My heart was pounding. This was no coincidence. The truck stop was still a few miles away, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it before the car tried something. Then I saw a turnoff for a small road leading into the hills. I didn't know where it went, but I figured a big rig like mine could handle it better than a car. I took the turn without signaling, my tires squealing on the asphalt. The car followed, but I could see its headlights bouncing in the rear-view mirror as it struggled on the rougher road. I pushed my truck harder, navigating the twists and turns as best I could. After about 10 minutes, the headlights disappeared. I didn't slow down, though. I kept going until I saw a clearing where I could pull over and turn off my lights. I sat there in the dark, listening, waiting for the sound of an engine. But there was nothing, just the night and the distant sound of crickets. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to start the engine again. I needed to get back to the highway, find that truck stop, and be around other people. I carefully made my way back to the main road, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of those headlights. When I finally pulled into the truck stop, it felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I parked among the other rigs and headed inside to get a cup of coffee and calm my nerves. The place was brightly lit, the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes a comforting contrast to the silence of the night outside. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the person at the rest stop in the car that followed me. Who were they? What did they want? I never got any answers, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. The next day, I called my buddy Jack, another trucker who ran the same routes. We'd been friends for years, and I knew I could trust him. I told him what happened, expecting him to laugh it off or say I was overreacting. But he didn't. "Vic," he said, his voice serious, "I've heard stories about that stretch of road. Drivers disappearing, strange people at rest stops. No one knows for sure what's going on, but you're not the first to have something like this happen." That sent a chill down my spine. Jack wasn't one to buy into ghost stories or urban legends. If he was taking it seriously, then I knew I wasn't crazy. I finished my delivery in Portland without any more incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rest stop, every lonely stretch of road, I found myself looking over my shoulder. waiting for something to happen. A few weeks later, I was back in Twin Falls on another run. I decided to stop at the same rest area, partly out of curiosity, partly to see if I could get some closure. It was daytime this time, and there were a few other trucks parked there. I felt a bit safer. I walked to the restroom, my bat left behind in the cab, but my nerves on edge. The place looked the same, but it felt different in the daylight. Less sinister, more mundane. I pushed open the third stall door again, half expecting to find something, but it was empty. As I was about to leave, an older trucker walked in. He nodded at me and went about his business. I hesitated, then decided to ask him if he'd seen anything strange around here. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I've been driving these roads for 30 years, seen all kinds of weird stuff. But if you're talking about the guy in the black sedan, you're not alone. A few drivers have mentioned being followed by someone like that. Cops don't do much about it, though. Just say it's someone messing around." That didn't make me feel any better. But at least I knew I wasn't the only one. I got back in my truck and headed out, my eyes still scanning the road, but with a bit more resolve. I wasn't going to let some creep scare me off my route, but I made a point to avoid stopping at deserted rest areas, sticking to the busy truck stops where I knew I'd be safer. Years later, I retired from trucking. The open road lost its appeal after that night. I never found out who was behind the wheel of that car, or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some punk playing a prank, or maybe it was something more sinister. But I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that night. It might have saved my life. Sometimes when I tell this story to friends over a beer, they ask if I'd do anything different. I tell them no. I did what I had to do to stay safe. And if they're ever out on those lonely highways at night, they should do the same. Because you never know who might be watching. My name is Orson Devereaux, and this happened to me on November 14th, 2003. I was working as a long-haul truck driver back then. My usual route took me across the Midwest, through the small towns and open fields of Indiana. I liked the solitude of the job, the long hours on the road, and the simple pleasure of a hot cup of coffee at a roadside diner. One night, I was driving a load of auto parts from Detroit to St. Louis. The night was clear and cold, and I had the radio tuned to a classic rock station. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and pulled off at a truck stop just outside a little town called Crawfordsville. I grabbed a coffee and a sandwich and chatted briefly with the waitress, a friendly woman named Beth. She told me about some local gossip and warned me to be careful because there had been a few strange disappearances in the area recently. I shrugged it off as small-town paranoia. I've been through dozens of these places, and every one of them has some spooky tale to tell. After my break, I got back into the cab and hit the road again. The highway was empty, just me and the hum of the engine. About an hour later, I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far off at first, but slowly grew closer. I didn't think much of it until the car got right up behind me, tailgating me for a good few miles. It was odd because the road was empty, and there was plenty of space to pass. I slowed down, hoping they'd go around, but they just stayed there, close enough that I could make out the shape of the car. A dark sedan, maybe a Ford or a Chevy. After a few more minutes, the car finally pulled out to pass. As it came up alongside me, I glanced over and saw a man behind the wheel, staring straight ahead. There was something off about him. His face was expressionless, almost robotic. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the road. He passed me and sped off into the night. I shook it off as just another weirdo on the road. But about 20 minutes later, I saw those same headlights again, this time on the side of the road. The car was pulled over, and the driver was outside, leaning against the hood. As I approached, he raised his hand, signaling for help. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over. Truckers help each other out, and maybe this guy genuinely needed assistance. I stopped the truck and climbed out, leaving the engine running and the lights on. As I walked towards him, I noticed he was holding something, a wrench, maybe a tire iron. I called out, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't respond, just stared at me with those cold, dead eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept walking. When I was about 10 feet away, he suddenly lunged at me with the wrench. I jumped back, narrowly avoiding the blow. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the truck. I could hear his footsteps pounding the pavement behind me. I reached the cab and slammed the door just as he reached the truck. He started banging on the door with the wrench, screaming something incoherent. I floored the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward, leaving him behind in a cloud of exhaust. My heart was pounding as I sped down the highway, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of him. I drove non-stop until I reached a rest area about 50 miles down the road. I pulled in and parked, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I called the local sheriff's office and reported what had happened. The dispatcher took my information and promised to send a patrol car out to check the area. I didn't sleep much that night, just sat in the cab with a baseball bat I kept behind the seat, jumping at every little noise. By morning, I was exhausted but decided to keep moving. I delivered my load in St. Louis and tried to put the whole incident behind me. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They found the car abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of the driver. The car was reported stolen, and the guy who attacked me was still at large. They advised me to be cautious and to report any further encounters. Over the next few months, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped at a truck stop or rest area, I scanned the parking lot for that dark sedan. My nerves were shot, and I started carrying a pistol in the cab for protection. I didn't have a permit, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. Then, one night in late February, I was driving through the same stretch of Indiana when I saw those familiar headlights in my mirror. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just paranoia. The car stayed behind me for a few miles before pulling out to pass. I braced myself as it came alongside, but this time there was no one in the driver's seat. The car was empty, cruising along beside me as if it had a mind of its own. I stared in disbelief, and then the car swerved towards me, sideswiping the truck. I fought to keep control as the truck veered off the road, plowing into a ditch. The car kept going, disappearing into the night. I sat there, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I called the sheriff's office again and reported the incident. They sent out a tow truck and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do without any solid evidence. After that, I took a few weeks off to clear my head. I considered quitting the job altogether, but I loved the road too much to give it up. When I finally went back to work, I made sure to avoid that stretch of highway. A year passed without any incidents. I started to think maybe it was all in my head, a product of stress and exhaustion. Then, one night in early December, I was driving through northern Kentucky when I saw a car broken down on the side of the road. I was about to pass by when I saw the driver, a young woman, waving frantically. Something about her seemed familiar, and as I got closer, I realized it was the same woman from the truck stop in Crawfordsville, Beth. I pulled over and got out, calling out to her. "Beth, what are you doing out here?" She looked terrified, glancing around nervously. "Orson, you've got to help me. He's after me." "Who's after you?" She didn't answer, just grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the truck. "Please, we have to go, now." I helped her into the cab and got back behind the wheel, my heart racing. As we drove, she told me a story that sent chills down my spine. The man who had attacked me was her ex-husband, a violent and unstable man who had been stalking her for years. She had moved to Crawfordsville to escape him, but he had found her. She had been trying to get away, but he was always one step ahead. As she spoke, I noticed a pair of headlights in the mirror. The same dark sedan was following us, closing in fast. I pushed the pedal to the floor, trying to outrun him, but the car kept gaining. Beth screamed as the car rammed into the back of the truck, sending us swerving across the road. I fought to keep control, but the car hit us again, harder this time. The truck skidded off the road, crashing into a fence. I was dazed but managed to get out of the cab. Beth was unconscious, slumped over in her seat. I grabbed the pistol from under the seat and stepped out, ready to face him. The man stepped out of the car, a twisted smile on his face. He was holding a knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. I aimed the gun at him, my hands shaking. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll shoot." He didn't respond, just kept walking towards me. I fired a warning shot into the ground, but he didn't even flinch. As he got closer, I could see the madness in his eyes, a wild, unhinged look that sent a chill down my spine. I fired again, this time aiming for his leg. The bullet hit its mark and he stumbled, falling to the ground. I ran back to the truck and tried to wake Beth, but she was still out cold. I called 911 and waited, keeping an eye on the man as he lay there, clutching his leg. The police arrived within minutes, and they took him into custody. Beth was taken to the hospital, and I was left to answer a barrage of questions. In the end, it turned out that Beth's ex-husband had been following me for months, using me to get to her. He was a dangerous man with a history of violence, and he had been responsible for the disappearances in Crawfordsville. Beth recovered, and we stayed in touch for a while. She eventually moved out of state, changing her name to start a new life. I continued driving, but I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if he had any accomplices out there. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it every time I drive through Indiana. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing as terrifying as those nights when I was being hunted by a madman. I learned to trust my instincts and never to let my guard down, because you never know what's lurking out there on the open highway. My name is Duke Sullivan, and this happened to me in the summer of 1995. I was a truck driver hauling freight across the Midwest, mostly small towns and back roads. It was a good job for a guy like me, kept me on the move, no bosses breathing down my neck, and plenty of time to think. I was 35 back then, a bit rough around the edges, but enjoying the life. Little did I know, that summer would change everything. I had just picked up a load in Elkhart, Indiana, and was headed to a little town in Missouri. It was a hot day, the kind where sweat sticks to your back and the sun glares off the asphalt like it's got a personal grudge. I remember stopping at a small diner just off Highway 50, grabbing a quick bite. There was nothing special about the place, just greasy food and bad coffee, but it did the trick. The waitress, a young woman named Jenny, was chatty. She asked me about my route, my truck, the usual small-town curiosity. She mentioned something about a missing girl from a nearby town, said her picture was on the news. I nodded, half listening, more focused on my burger. People go missing all the time, right? Didn't think much of it then. I finished up and got back on the road, pushing through the afternoon heat. About an hour in, my CB radio crackled to life. It was another driver, Joe, who I'd run into a few times at various stops. Joe was one of those guys who always had a story, usually too good to be true. But he was good company on the long hauls. "Hey Duke, you out there?" Joe's voice came through the static. "Yeah, I'm here." "What's up, Joe?" I replied, adjusting the volume. "You hear about that girl? The one from Sterling? Word is they found her car, but not her. Weird stuff, man. Real weird." "Yeah, some waitress was talking about it. What do you think happened?" "Could be anything. Runaway, maybe. Or something worse. You know how it is." I didn't say much more. Just listened to Joe ramble on about other missing person cases he'd heard of. By the time I rolled into Sterling, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the town. It was a quiet place, one of those towns where everyone knows everyone else, and strangers stick out like a sore thumb. I pulled into a rest area just outside of town, figuring I'd catch a few hours of sleep before heading out early in the morning. The place was empty except for a couple of parked cars. I climbed into my sleeper cab, cracked the window to let in some air, and settled in for the night. I must have dozed off pretty quick because the next thing I knew, there was a tapping on my window. Groggy, I rubbed my eyes and peered out. Standing there was a middle-aged man, scruffy, with a worn-out baseball cap. He looked desperate, his eyes darting around nervously. "Hey, buddy, you got a minute?" he asked, voice shaky. I rolled down the window a bit more. "What's going on?" "My daughter, she's missing. You a trucker? You see a girl, maybe 16, brown hair, blue eyes? Her name's Emily." It hit me then. This was the missing girl Jenny and Joe had mentioned. I shook my head. "Sorry, man. I haven't seen anyone. When did she go missing?" "A couple days ago. We found her car by the old quarry, but no sign of her. Please, if you see anything, let us know." I nodded, giving him my best reassuring look. He handed me a flyer with her picture and some contact information. I took it, feeling a pang of sympathy. Losing a kid must be the worst thing imaginable. He thanked me and walked off into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. Something about his desperation got under my skin. I started thinking about my own life, the people I'd lost touch with, the roads I'd traveled. I decided to take a look around the quarry in the morning, just to see if there was anything out of place. Not that I expected to find anything. What did I know about finding missing people? Morning came, and I headed out to the quarry. It was an old abandoned site, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken equipment. I parked the truck and started walking, looking for any signs of the girl. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a piece of clothing, a bag, anything that might help. I was about to give up when I saw it. A small, worn-out sneaker partially hidden under some bushes. My heart skipped a beat. I crouched down, picking it up carefully. It was dirty, like it had been out here for a while. I looked around, suddenly feeling very alone. Then I saw him. A man, tall and lanky, standing on the ridge above me. He was watching me, his face unreadable. I raised my hand in a half wave, trying to act casual, but my mind was racing. Something about him felt off. He didn't wave back. Instead, he turned and disappeared over the ridge. I quickly stuffed the sneaker into my jacket and made my way back to the truck. As I started the engine, my mind was buzzing. Who was that guy? What was he doing out here? And most importantly, was Emily still alive? I drove back to town, stopping at the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Harris, listened patiently as I told him about the sneaker and the man I'd seen. "You sure about this?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, I'm sure. Look, I know it's not much, but maybe it's something." He sighed, taking the sneaker from me. "All right, I'll send someone out to check it. In the meantime, you keep your eyes open. And be careful, Duke. This ain't the kind of place where people go missing." I nodded and left, feeling a mix of frustration and unease. I got back in my truck, ready to leave this place behind. But as I drove out of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next couple of days were uneventful. I made my deliveries, chatted with other drivers, and tried to put Sterling out of my mind. But every time I stopped, I found myself checking the news, looking for updates on Emily. It was late one night, somewhere in Missouri, when I got a call from Joe on the CB. "Duke, you got a minute?" "Yeah, what's up?" Sheriff Harris called. Said they found more evidence near that quarry. Some blood, looks like, and they're still looking for that guy you saw. "Damn, you think they'll find her?" "I hope so. But listen, there's something else. A buddy of mine, Frank, he was in Sterling yesterday. He said he saw a guy matching your description hanging around the truck stop there. Creepy as hell. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think he's following us?" "Could be. Just keep your eyes open, all right?" I thanked Joe and signed off, feeling a new sense of unease. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to that man at the quarry. What if he was following me? What if he knew I'd seen him? I decided to stop at a rest area for the night, somewhere well lit and busy. Safety in numbers, right? But as I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around midnight when I heard the noise. A soft scraping, like someone was trying to open the door of my cab. My heart pounded as I grabbed a wrench from under the seat. I stayed quiet, listening. The noise stopped, then started again on the other side. I took a deep breath and threw the door open, wrench raised. There was no one there, just the darkness and the distant hum of the highway. I climbed out, checking around the truck, but found nothing. Just as I was about to get back in, I saw it. Another sneaker, just like the one I'd found at the quarry, lying near my rear tires. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was messing with me. I picked up the sneaker and got back in the cab, locking the doors. Sleep was out of the question. I sat there, clutching the wrench, waiting for the dawn. When morning finally came, I drove straight to the nearest police station. I handed over the sneaker and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I could tell they thought I was just a paranoid trucker. I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I called Joe, told him what happened. He agreed it was best to lay low for a while, maybe change my route. I took his advice, steering clear of Sterling and its surrounding areas. A few weeks passed and things started to feel normal again. The memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routine of the road. But then, out of the blue, I got a call from Sheriff Harris. "Duke, we found him. The guy you saw. He's dead." "What? How?" "Looks like he fell off a cliff near the quarry. We found his body yesterday. But here's the thing. He had more of Emily's stuff with him. We're still searching the area." A mix of relief and confusion washed over me. So, he was the one? Seems like it, but we still don't know what happened to Emily. Just thought you should know. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange sense of closure. The man I'd seen was dead, but Emily was still missing. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was something. I kept driving, kept working, but the memory of that summer stayed with me. Every time I passed through a small town, I thought of Emily and her father, of the desperation in his eyes. I never saw Joe again. He retired a few years later and moved to Florida. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while, but eventually lost touch. Life went on, as it always does. But every now and then, when the road is long and the night is quiet, I think back to that hot summer day in Sterling. I think about the sneaker, the man on the ridge, and the girl who never came home. And I wonder. My name is Daryl Fletcher, and this happened to me on July 17th, 2009. I was a truck driver back then, driving long hauls across the country. It was a job I loved and hated in equal measure. You get to see the country, sure, but the loneliness can be a killer. Anyway, I was on a run from Kansas City to some small town in Wyoming. Can't remember the name now. The route took me through the back roads, the kind of roads where you can go hours without seeing another soul. It was getting late, the sky turning a dark purple, and I decided to pull into a rest area I knew was about an hour ahead. One of those real out-of-the-way places where the facilities are pretty much just a bathroom and a couple of vending machines. I'd been driving since dawn and needed to stretch my legs and maybe catch a quick nap before the last leg of the trip. I pulled in, parked my rig, and noticed another truck already there. A dark blue Peterbilt. Didn't think much of it. Truckers often stopped here. I got out, lit a cigarette, and took a deep breath of the cooling air. It felt good to be out of the cab. As I walked towards the restrooms, I noticed something odd. There was a trail of what looked like dark, dried liquid leading from the truck to the bathroom. Oil, I thought at first, but it was too dark, too thick. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the trail. It led to the restroom door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a sickly, sweet odor mixed with the usual restroom stink. My eyes adjusted to the dim light and I saw it. A man, slumped against the wall, blood everywhere. His throat had been slit and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. I backed out, my heart pounding. I'd never seen anything like that before. I knew I had to call the cops, but my cell was dead and the payphone outside was out of order. Typical. I ran back to my truck, hoping to use my CB radio to call for help. As I fumbled with the mic, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was coming out of the other truck. The guy was tall, lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved with a casual confidence that set my nerves on edge. I pretended not to see him, focusing on getting a signal out. I managed to reach another trucker who promised to relay my call to the authorities. As I signed off, the man approached my truck. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm and even. "Yeah, just checking my route," I lied. "You?" He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile. "Just stretching my legs." I nodded and watched him walk towards the bathroom. My gut told me to get out of there, but I needed to wait for the cops. I kept the engine running, ready to bolt if things got hairy. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car. I flagged them down, and 2 officers stepped out. I told them what I'd seen, and they went to check the bathroom. Moments later, one of them came back, looking pale. "Stay in your truck, sir," he said. "We'll handle this." I nodded and watched as they secured the area. The guy in the cap was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't seen him leave, but he wasn't around anymore. One of the officers came back to take my statement. I told him everything, including the guy I'd seen. "Did you get a good look at him?" the officer asked. "Not really," I admitted. "Baseball cap, lean, maybe 6 feet tall. Didn't see his face clearly." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "All right, we'll need you to stick around for a bit." I spent the next few hours talking to the cops, repeating my story. They asked if I had any enemies or if I thought someone might be targeting me. I laughed at the absurdity. "I'm just a truck driver," I said. "Who'd want to come after me?" They didn't have an answer, but they took my information and told me to stay in touch. By the time they let me go, it was well past midnight. I decided to push through the last leg of my trip. The image of that dead man burned into my mind. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I pulled into a rest area, I scanned the shadows for that guy in the cap. But I never saw him again. The cops never contacted me either, and I never heard if they caught the guy. Life went on, but I changed, became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I guess you could say it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how routine life seems, danger can be just around the corner, and sometimes it wears a friendly smile and a baseball cap. A couple of months after that night, I found myself on another long haul, this time through the deserts of New Mexico. It was the kind of drive that gave you too much time to think. My mind kept wandering back to that rest area, the blood, and the guy in the cap. I wondered if he was still out there somewhere looking for his next victim. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed it away. I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to get spooked. One night, I pulled into a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. It was a bigger place with a diner and a small convenience store. There were a few other trucks parked, their drivers inside getting a meal or some shut-eye. I decided to grab a coffee and maybe a piece of pie, something to break the monotony of the road. As I walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned to look at me. Truckers are a tight-knit group, always curious about a new face. I found a seat at the counter and ordered my coffee and pie. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought my order and struck up a conversation. "Long haul?" she asked, pouring my coffee. "Yeah, I replied. Just passing through. She nodded, wiping down the counter. Stay safe out there. You hear about that murder a while back? Some trucker found a guy dead at a rest stop. My heart skipped a beat. Yeah, I heard about it, I said, keeping my voice steady. Crazy stuff. She sighed. World's a dangerous place. Gotta watch your back. I finished my coffee and pie, paid my bill, and headed back to my truck. As I walked across the parking lot, I noticed a figure standing by one of the trucks. He was tall, lean, and wore a baseball cap. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep walking, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I climbed into my cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my mirrors. The guy was gone. I told myself it was just a coincidence, another trucker stretching his legs, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every rest stop, every diner, I kept my eyes peeled for that guy in the cap, but he never showed up again. A year later, I decided to take a break from trucking. The road had lost its charm, and I needed a change. I took a job at a local warehouse, working regular hours and sleeping in my own bed. Life was good, but I never forgot that night. One evening, I was watching the news when a story caught my attention. Another trucker had found a body at a rest stop, the victim's throat slit just like before. The police were looking for a suspect, a man described as tall, lean, and wearing a baseball cap. I turned off the TV and sat in the silence, the memories flooding back. I knew it was him, the same guy who had haunted my thoughts for the past year. I wondered how many other victims were out there, how many more would fall before he was caught. Life goes on, but some things stay with you. I still drive past that rest area sometimes, on my way to visit family or take a trip. I can't help but glance at the bathroom door, half expecting to see that trail of dark, dried liquid leading inside. My name is Leroy Cantrell, and this all went down in July of 2009. I remember it clearly because it was a hot, sticky summer, and I was behind the wheel of my old Freightliner, hauling a load of steel beams to a construction site in southern Missouri. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and you'd think I'd seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was rolling down Highway 60, somewhere between Poplar Bluff and Van Buren, in the middle of nowhere. There's this stretch of road that cuts through the Mark Twain National Forest, beautiful during the day, but desolate and eerie once the sun goes down. That evening, I was making good time, planning to stop at a truck stop near Springfield to grab a bite and catch some sleep. I just crossed over the Black River when I noticed a beat-up old pickup on the side of the road, hood up, and a guy waving frantically. Now, truckers have an unspoken code. You help each other out. So I slowed down, pulled over, and hopped out to see what was up. The guy was maybe in his late 40s, scruffy beard, wearing a greasy baseball cap and a stained flannel shirt. He looked like he'd been working on that truck all day. "Hey man, need a hand?" I called out, walking over. "Thank God you stopped," he said, looking relieved. "I'm Ray. Truck just up and died on me. Think it's the alternator. Any chance you could give me a ride to the nearest town?" I sized him up. He seemed harmless enough, and I couldn't just leave him stranded. "Sure, hop in," I said. "Nearest town's about 20 miles up the road." Ray grabbed a small duffel bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat. We got moving again, and he was a talker. Told me he was from Alabama, heading up to visit his sister in St. Louis. Said his truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he'd been hoping to make it just a bit further. We were maybe 15 minutes down the road when I noticed a car in my rearview mirror, tailing us pretty close. At first I didn't think much of it, probably just someone impatient with my speed. But then it stayed right on us, which was weird given we were the only two vehicles on the road. "You know that car?" I asked Ray, nodding towards the mirror. He turned to look, and his face went pale. "Nah, no idea who that is," he said, but his voice wavered. Maybe it's a cop, I joked, trying to lighten the mood. You running from the law, Ray? He forced a laugh. No, nothing like that. But I could tell something was off. I kept an eye on the car, which followed us for another 10 miles, never once trying to pass, just tailing us like a shark. When we hit a stretch where the forest thickened on either side, it finally made its move. The car sped up, swerved around us, and cut us off, forcing me to brake hard. What the hell? I muttered. The car stopped dead in front of us, blocking the road. A tall, thin guy in a dark jacket got out and started walking towards us. He had a gun. Stay calm, Ray, I said, my heart racing. I reached under my seat, but I remembered I'd left my pistol at home. Company policy had recently cracked down on drivers carrying weapons, and I'd decided to play it safe. The guy reached my door and yanked it open. Out of the truck, he ordered, pointing the gun at my face. I glanced at Ray, who looked terrified. Look, we don't want any trouble, I said, raising my hands. Take whatever you want. I said, get out of the truck, he barked. We did as we were told, climbing down slowly. Ray stumbled, almost falling. The guy motioned us to the side of the road, keeping the gun trained on us. Empty your pockets, he said. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. You can take the truck, man, I said. Just let us go. Shut up, he snapped. He took our stuff and tossed it into the car. Then he walked back to us, his eyes darting nervously. You, he pointed at me. Get in the truck and start it. I glanced at Ray, who looked like he might pass out. Don't try anything, the guy warned, jabbing the gun in my direction. I got back into the cab and turned the key. The engine roared to life. The guy motioned for Ray to get in the car. You drive, he ordered me. With Ray in the car and me in the truck, I had no idea what his plan was. But I wasn't about to argue with a gun. I started driving again, following the car as it led the way down the highway. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The car led us down a narrow dirt road off the highway, deeper into the forest. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was no way out. The trees closed in around us, and I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the car stopped in a small clearing. The guy got out, still holding the gun, and walked over to my door. Turn it off, he said. I did. Out, he ordered again. I climbed down, my hands trembling. He motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Ray was already being led by another man I hadn't noticed before. This one was shorter, stocky, with a mean look in his eyes. Move, the first guy said, prodding me with the gun. We walked for a few minutes until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. My gut twisted with fear. They pushed us inside, and I saw it was empty except for some old furniture and trash. Sit, the second guy said, shoving Ray onto a dirty couch. I sat next to him, trying to think of a way out. What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The first guy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a little insurance, he said. Make sure you don't go running to the cops. He turned to his partner. Get the rope. I felt a cold sweat break out as the second guy rummaged through a bag and pulled out a length of rope. They tied us up, wrists and ankles, and left us on the couch. Don't go anywhere, the first guy said with a laugh, and they walked out, closing the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, I started struggling against the ropes. We have to get out of here, I whispered to Ray, who was shaking uncontrollably. They're going to kill us, aren't they? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not if we get out first, I said, trying to sound confident. I wriggled my wrists, trying to loosen the knots. It was slow, painful work, but I could feel the rope starting to give. We heard the car start up and drive away, leaving us in the eerie silence of the forest. Come on, damn it, I muttered, finally getting one hand free. I quickly untied the rest and turned to help Ray. Leroy, thank you, he said, his voice cracking. Save it for later, I said. We need to move. We stumbled out of the cabin, looking around. The car was gone, and there was no sign of the two men. "Which way?" Ray asked, his eyes wide with fear. "We follow the road," I said. "It's our best chance." We started walking, keeping to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of trouble. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the forest. I kept my ears open, listening for any sound of the car returning. After what felt like forever, we heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. "Hide!" I hissed, dragging Ray into the underbrush. We crouched down, holding our breath as the car drew closer. It wasn't the same car. This one was a beat-up old sedan, and the driver looked like an older man, probably a local. I stood up, waving my arms. "Hey, over here!" The car slowed down and stopped. The driver rolled down his window, looking at us suspiciously. "What's going on here?" "Please, we need help," I said. "We were carjacked and kidnapped. Can you call the police?" The man looked us over, then nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff's office." We climbed into the back seat, exhausted and relieved. The man introduced himself as Earl, and he drove us to the nearest town, a small place called Ellington. At the sheriff's office, we gave our statements, describing the two men and what had happened. The sheriff, a grizzled old-timer named Frank, took our story seriously. "We'll get a patrol out there to look for your truck and those men," he said. "You two are lucky to be alive." Ray and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but shaken to the core. The sheriff's deputies drove us back to the clearing, where they found my truck, abandoned but otherwise untouched. There was no sign of the men or Ray's pickup. "Stay alert," the sheriff said as we prepared to leave. "These guys might come back." We thanked him and got back on the road, heading to the nearest truck stop. We needed to call our companies and report what had happened, but more than that, we needed to get some rest. As we drove away, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to dying out there. I'd always considered myself a tough guy, but this experience had shaken me. Ray was quiet, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We parted ways at the truck stop, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. I never saw him again, but I think about him every time I pass through southern Missouri. That night changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the dangers out on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard, always ready for the unexpected. And every now and then, when I'm driving through the dark stretches of highway, I remember those two men and wonder if they ever got caught. If they're still out there, looking for their next victim. But I don't let it consume me. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road never stops calling, and there's always another load to haul, another destination to reach. And as long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward, no matter what. That's the life of a trucker. Always moving, always watching, always surviving. My name is Randall O'Malley, and this happened to me on October 17th, 2003. I remember the date because it was right around my birthday, and I was stuck on the road, driving my rig through the back roads of West Virginia. Being a truck driver ain't glamorous, but it pays the bills and gets me away from the city noise. I was heading towards a small town called Bramwell, carrying a load of auto parts. The plan was to drop off the goods and then hightail it back to Chicago for a long weekend. That was the plan anyway. I'd been driving for about 8 hours straight when I decided to pull over at a rest stop. It was one of those quiet places off Highway 52, not much more than a couple of vending machines and a bathroom. I parked my truck and got out to stretch my legs. My back was killing me, and I needed a cigarette. As I lit up and leaned against the hood, I noticed an old beat-up Ford parked at the edge of the lot. It wasn't uncommon to see cars in these spots, but something about this one felt off. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. A guy in a faded denim jacket came out of the bathroom. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had a sort of twitchy way about him. He glanced at me, then at the Ford, and quickly looked away. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and just sat there, idling. I figured he was another trucker or a drifter. You see all kinds on the road. I finished my smoke and headed to the vending machine for a soda. As I was fumbling for change, I heard the rumble of an engine and looked up. The guy in the Ford was pulling out, but not before he took one last long look at me. It wasn't friendly. I brushed it off and got back in my truck. The sun was setting, and I still had a couple of hours to go before I'd reach Bramwell. I turned on the radio, found a classic rock station, and hit the road. The highway was empty, which was a blessing and a curse. It made for easy driving, but it also made you feel isolated, like you were the only person left in the world. About an hour in, I noticed headlights in my side mirror. They were far back, but closing in fast. Within minutes, the car was tailing me, way too close for comfort. I squinted at the mirror and recognized the Ford. The same beat-up piece of junk from the rest stop. What the hell does this guy want? I muttered to myself. I tried speeding up, but the Ford matched my pace. I slowed down, and he did the same. It was starting to freak me out. I honked my horn, hoping he'd get the message and back off. No dice. He just stayed there like a shadow. I decided to pull over, hoping he'd pass me. I signaled and eased onto the shoulder. Instead of passing, he pulled over too, about 50 feet behind me. This was getting ridiculous. I grabbed my flashlight and got out, intending to have a word with this lunatic. I walked toward the car, and as I got closer, I could see the guy's silhouette behind the wheel. He was just sitting there, staring at me. I stopped about 10 feet away and yelled, "Hey man, what's your problem?" He didn't respond, didn't even flinch, just kept those creepy eyes on me. I felt a chill run down my spine but shook it off. I wasn't about to let some weirdo intimidate me. "Look, buddy, if you've got something to say it. Otherwise, get lost." Still nothing. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight into the car. That's when I saw it. Blood. There was blood smeared on the passenger seat and dashboard. My heart started pounding. This wasn't just some random nut job. Something bad had gone down in that car. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off him. When I was a safe distance, I turned and sprinted back to my truck. I locked the doors and grabbed my cell phone. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere. I decided to make a run for it. I started the engine and floored it. The Ford's headlights flared up, and he was right on my tail again. Panic set in. I needed to find help, and fast. Bramwell wasn't too far now. If I could just make it there. The next 20 minutes were a blur of speed and fear. The Ford stuck to me like glue, swerving erratically. I kept honking my horn, flashing my lights, hoping someone would notice. Finally, I saw the lights of Bramwell in the distance. I gunned it, my truck roaring as it pushed past the speed limit. I barreled into town, heading straight for the gas station I'd seen on my map. It was late, but the place was still open. I pulled in hard, tires screeching, and jumped out, shouting for help. The attendant, a young guy named Cody, came running out. "What's going on?" "That guy's been following me for miles." I pointed down the road, but the Ford was gone, disappeared like a ghost. Cody looked skeptical but nodded. "Come inside. We'll call the sheriff." Inside, Cody dialed the local sheriff's office. I paced around, trying to calm down. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting the Ford to come screeching into the lot. About 10 minutes later, Sheriff Tomlinson arrived. He was an older guy, grizzled but kind-looking. "Mr. O'Malley, Cody here says you've been having some trouble." I told him everything, from the rest stop to the blood in the car. He listened, nodding occasionally, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. "All right, let's take a look," he said finally. We went back outside, but the Ford was still nowhere to be seen. The sheriff looked around, then back at me. "I'll have a patrol keep an eye out. but you might want to stay in town tonight, just to be safe. Cody offered to let me park my truck behind the gas station and even gave me a cot in the back room to crash on. I was too shaken to argue. I thanked him and tried to get some sleep, but every noise had me on edge. I kept thinking about those bloodstains and the dead look in that guy's eyes. The next morning, I decided to head out early. The sun was just coming up as I climbed into my truck, hoping to put as many miles between me and Bramwell as possible. As I pulled onto the highway, I saw Sheriff Tomlinson parked at the edge of town. He waved, and I waved back, grateful for his help. I drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly before me. The events of the night before started to feel like a bad dream, something I could shake off. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I saw it. The Ford, parked at the side of the road, the same guy leaning against it, watching me. My heart raced and I felt a surge of anger. Enough was enough. I pulled over and grabbed my tire iron. I wasn't going to let this psycho mess with me anymore. As I marched toward him, he straightened up, a faint smile playing on his lips. I stopped a few feet away, gripping the tire iron tight. "What do you want?" I demanded. He didn't answer, just stared at me with those dead eyes. I felt a surge of fear and swung the tire iron, but he dodged it easily, grabbing my arm and twisting it. Pain shot through me, and I dropped the iron. He shoved me to the ground and pulled out a knife. I scrambled back, kicking at him, but he was relentless. I managed to get to my feet and ran back to my truck, my arm throbbing. I jumped in and locked the door just as he reached me, slashing at the window with the knife. The glass held, but just barely. I fumbled for the ignition and started the truck, slamming it into gear. The tires squealed as I sped away, the guy still slashing at my window. I drove like a madman, heart pounding, until I couldn't see him anymore. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a police station and told them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I stayed in that town for a couple of days, too scared to get back on the road. When I finally did, I took a different route, avoiding West Virginia altogether. The memory of that guy, his dead eyes, and the blood in his car still haunts me. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. I'm never taking the back roads again. Years later, I still think about that night. I still see his face in my nightmares. Some things you just can't shake. I kept on driving trucks, but I was always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if he was out there waiting. If you ever find yourself on Highway 52 near Bramwell, be careful. You never know who you might run into.